Hello, welcome to another screencast where I'll be discussing the respiratory functional anatomy and just give you an overview here, an introduction. So by the end of this, you'll be able to identify and describe, explain the functions of the respiratory system, and there are five of them according to the text. And then being able to identify just the gross anatomical components of the different respiratory tracts. So the respiratory system, as the title up here says, respiratory system provides the body's cells with the means for obtaining oxygen and eliminating carbon dioxide. Of course, this oxygen, sorry about that, the oxygen here is going to be used in cell respiration to get cells their energy, ATP production, etc. And along the way of that ATP production, those cells produce carbon dioxide, so we got to get rid of that constantly. So the functions of the respiratory system then, number one, providing a large surface area for this gas exchange. So a large surface area for the gas exchange. And that large surface area is, of course, here in the lungs. So if we're going to look at the microscopic anatomy of this, and if you look at the surface area there, it's about the size of a tennis court. And pardon me, this is where that gas exchange is going to happen between the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. So there's a large surface area there in the lungs. Then there's passageways to move that air. Passageways to move the air into and out. So we have, of course, the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, the pharynx or the throat, this larynx, and then the trachea and the bronchi. So these are essentially tubing here that's open to the outside world at the nose and at the mouth. And this is where the air is going to get in and out. And then there's a certain degree of protection that's involved in the anatomy of the respiratory system. So protecting the respiratory surfaces here from dehydration. So some of you may know that if you're in an enclosed space where the air is really dry, it's very difficult to breathe. So there are mechanisms in place to protect against dehydration, to protect against temperature changes. And especially this time of year when I'm making this, it's winter and it's extremely cold, and so that extremely cold air will irritate some people's ability to breathe and exchange that oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then finally, protection against invaders, as the text says here. And of course, we're talking about viruses, we're talking about bacteria, we're talking about fungal spores, and potentially other parasites that may get in there. But really the big ones, the viruses, bacteria, and fungal spores here, protecting against that. Because, of course, this is open to the outside world. So if you had one of those get in here and get across this membrane, you could go systemic into the cardiovascular system and have all sorts of problems there. So there's mechanisms in place there to protect against those things infecting us. Another component that's not really related to gas exchange, but is important for us, is the sense of smell or olfaction. Right. So olfaction is the sense of smell, and so that's going to be, there's specialized structures here in the roof of the nasal cavity that are going to be directly in contact with cranial nerve number one, the olfactory nerve, and providing smell, the sensation of smell. And lastly, the fifth function, again, another one that's extremely important to us that involves here this larynx area, is vocalization or speech. Vocalization or speech, being able to communicate, is a very important skill is a very important sense that we have, and not only speech but singing and other forms of vocalization and communication. So these five here again, the two big ones here in terms of gas exchange, carbon dioxide and oxygen, this protection, and then the sense of smell, and then vocalization. So you can kind of break them down that way there. Right. So let's just take a little bit of a closer view then of some of the structures we'll be looking at in other screencasts in more detail. So the major respiratory organs are the passageways to conduct air to and from the alveoli of the lungs. So let's start up here where we know some things. So this is, of course, a sagittal section. So here we have the nose, and we'll be talking about this detail in another screencast. But air will enter this nose. Air also enters the mouth here, but primarily the nose. Air will then pass through the pharynx or the throat area. Air will not go down the esophagus, or shouldn't go down the esophagus in normal breathing. You can kind of force it to go down there, but shouldn't really be going down there in normal breathing. But then air will move down through the larynx and then the trachea. And as we move down the trachea branches. There's this right bronchus here and the left bronchus. So we have a right and left bronchus go on each side, and then those airways, those passageways begin to get smaller into primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, tertiary bronchus, and then finally into bronchioles, which are the smallest in diameter. Right? These structures are of the upper respiratory tract. When we get down to the lower respiratory tract, this is where the gas exchange actually occurs between, we see here, components of the cardiovascular system, arteries and veins, and this capillary network that is surrounding the alveoli. Sorry, I'm having a little problem with the pen here this time. This capillary network here, and this is where the carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange is going to take place. These alveoli are the smallest functional units here of the respiratory system. The alveoli, as you see, are these small little sacs, these small little blind-ended kind of cul-de-sacs, or little looks like grapes on a stem there. And this is going to have a membrane that lines here, and this membrane is going to be extremely thin to allow that gas exchange. Okay. So again, just a quick overview there of some of the functions, and then the gross and a little bit of the smaller anatomical features. Okay. So we should be able to here identify, describe, explain these functions of the respiratory system, as well as components of the respiratory tracts, upper and lower. Okay, thanks for listening. Bring your questions to class.